All right, so here we are. We'll just take a few moments to let people show up because I know people have been kind of in the waiting room here. And I did make a poll.
So are other people listening to us right now?
Yes, everyone is on, and I
Okay.
put up a poll just to kind of get a sense of how people have been managing themselves during this time, just to get a sense of where people are at.
Mhm.
So we'll just maybe give a minute or so to let people respond. And then, of course, there's the chat box. For those of you that have not used Zoom before, there's a chat box. If you're on your computer, there's a button that says More, and it has 3 dots. And if you click on that, it will show you a chat feature that you can open up, and then you can communicate with us. If you're on your iPad or your phone, you got to scroll over 3 times to find that chat function. And that's a good way to ask questions or make any comments that you might have, because everyone's going to be muted here. So I think there'll probably be more people that will be joining us. It looks like the numbers are rising as we're going here, but maybe we can just start by introducing ourselves here from the NARM Training Institute. I'm Brad Kammer. I'm one of the NARM faculty and training director, and just really happy that we're able to make this work to connect to our community. And I know there's a lot of people that have been trained with us, part of our community, and there's also a lot of people that are maybe for the first time coming and getting to know us and getting to know NARM. And so welcome everyone. And
go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I'm Larry Heller. I'm the founder creator of NARM, and looking forward today to meeting with our growing international community. I want a special welcome to we've got a very large group of people from Romania, so bună seara, and that sounds like Italian, but it's actually my best rendering of Romanian. But we also have people from many foreign countries and all over the United States and North America. So I'm just excited that in these difficult times we're able to at least meet together here virtually, and an opportunity to ask some of the questions maybe that have been on your mind, and do the best we can to answer them. Stephanie?
And I'm Stephanie Klein. I'm Assistant Training Director for the NARM Institute, and also faculty in training. So I'm happy to be here, excited to have been invited to be a part of the panel. Hopefully I can provide something here. If not, definitely some comedy as we work through what we're going through. I'm always good for some comedy. And I also feel that in this time, the world is getting smaller, and because we're all experiencing the same thing at the same time. And so it's interesting to be on a call like this with so many people from all over the world and feel our community and feel everybody coming together at this time of social distancing. I'm really appreciative of it. So looking forward to the next hour and a half.
yeah. Yeah, I know a lot of people are talking about this, but Larry and I talked about this on the podcast that we did, but people are kind of tweaking the language from social distancing to physical distancing, because really this is a time that we need to be socially connected, and things like this and other ways that we're finding creative methods of staying socially connected is really important in this time. And I think that idea of physical distancing to kind of manage the virus and the spread of the virus and the infection is important, but that how we stay connected socially is really critical here. So just in terms of what we're doing here for the next hour and a half together, I thought I would just orient everyone. First of all, thanks for so many people just filling out this poll. I'll be doing a few poll questions as we go. It's a kind of a new feature we're learning here, how to use. And that we're going to spend the first maybe 20 minutes or half an hour talking a little bit more about just managing specifically in this time of dealing with the coronavirus and the need for physical distancing and the issues around isolation and disconnection and some of the emotions that can be coming up for folks. And Larry's going to kind of walk us through, I think, from a NARM perspective about how we can use some of the NARM principles and skills to manage this really challenging time. And then after that, we're going to move into kind of a larger discussion about NARM and, not so specific about just managing our time right now that we're going through, but just how any questions that people might have about NARM. We were planning this event before all of the coronavirus stuff started happening, as a way of just giving everyone an access to us to talk about NARM and the NARM trainings. And so we'll move into that, and we'll be taking your questions. So while Larry and Stephanie are talking, I'll be kind of managing the chat box, and I'll be writing down questions that then I can pose to Larry and to the three of us. Larry, anything else you wanted to add there?
And just to say, because we have people who have, finished the whole series of trainings and then assisted, and we've also got people who've never been in an NARM training. So we've got a wide range of people. We welcome everybody here, and feel free to ask questions that are important to you, and we'll try and sort them out and respond in the best we can to a whole range of different questions. And as Brad was saying, of course we want to take a little time if it's needed to address the current situation, but we had planned on using this as an opportunity to talk about to bring up some of the questions that you may have about applying NARM in clinical practice and to your own personal development and so on.
Stephanie, anything else you wanted to add before we move forward?
Nope, good to go.
Okay. So Larry, I thought maybe we could start just, Larry and I did a podcast that was released in the last day or two through our podcast. It's called Transforming Trauma. You can find it on your little app on your phone, or you can find it on Google, of course. It's in the Apple podcast store. But so we did kind of a special one on just managing some of the emotions that are coming up around this time. And Larry, I thought this might be a good place for us to start. Just in terms of, I just had a client right before we started, and just managing this territory between the real fears, the real threats, and the way that it gets interplayed with our own, anxieties that we bring into this. And maybe that's a place we could start.
Well, again, because we have different levels of experience here, in NARM, we talk about fear as something quite distinct from anxiety. Fear in the NARM model, in the model that I developed, is really considered as an emotion. Anxiety is not. Anxiety is a reaction, and often we talk about it in older terms as signal anxiety. It's communicating something to us that we don't know yet. It's a way of some deeper part of ourselves communicating some kind of distress or some kind of emotion or some kind of reaction that isn't fully available to consciousness. So, of course, in these kinds of situations, when there is real fear, there is real danger out there. I don't want to minimize that. But at the same time, one of the things that Brad and I focused on in the podcast is that in addition to the real fear and the real challenge of managing isolation and all of the other elements that we're, as human beings on this planet dealing with right now, is that we want to be able to separate fear from anxiety. Because, and in anxiety, I'm talking specifically now about the various unresolved issues from our own childhood and our own developmental, history that get attached to real fears. And that's what makes them difficult to sort out, because we can't say that they're all, this is all just crazy and they're all foundless. There is reason for people to be cautious and to take appropriate steps. And, fear can be part of that process that help, to help you take care of yourself. But anxiety is often, again, this way of some part of yourself that you've been disconnected from, making itself known, using the context of this current worldwide crisis to surface.
And so people that are noticing an uptick of anxiety right now, how do we support them to navigate this territory for themselves?
Well, one of the things is to not take the anxiety at face value. We hold this position in NARM is that we don't want to run away from our anxiety, but it's also as opposed to some other models, it's not useful to take people deep into anxiety. That has a tendency to take them into collapse and into contraction. We don't want to do that, but we want to be able to stay present to the anxiety and be curious about what is it that some deeper part of ourself is trying to communicate. And again, as we talked about in the podcast, is that also not running away from some of these very real and challenging emotions. And again, even though they're very real and appropriate to the moment for all of us as human beings, because we're complex creatures, they also bring elements of our own unresolved development to the surface. And so, for example, there is a certain kind of grieving that's going on right now worldwide. Some people, of course, more than others. Some people are suffering more than others right now. But anytime that our way of life undergoes a radical change and we're being deprived of some of the things that we've gotten used to and enjoy and function to help regulate us and help in social engagement and all of these kinds of these dynamics that are so essential to us as human beings, as they get taken away, as they become less and less available, there is a real grieving that goes on in people. And I encourage people, I know Brad and Stephanie encourage people to not run away from that grief, to not get swallowed up in it, but to give it some space, to be in a certain kind of way mindful about emotions like grief or helplessness. That's another one that's very common these days, because we've got all of these unknowns with this virus. You can't see it. There's a threat there. It's a real threat, but at the same time, it evokes old unresolved threats. And so one of the ways, again, is to not run away from yourself, is to just to explore and be curious about the helplessness. Generally, what people experience, if they stay with these difficult states, they transform fairly quickly. If we try and narcotize ourselves in a variety of ways that we do, or run away from ourselves in a whole range of ways that we as human beings have, it actually tends to make these difficult emotional states more intractable, more difficult to manage, more threatening to us. It's like a ghost behind the door. And if we're not running away from ourselves, we're not running away from the grieving and the helplessness and all of the other range of emotions that come up, people tend to do better, and you gain confidence when you see that you don't have to shut yourself down in order to manage. So that's
one of the common things that people respond to is that my grief feels too big. If I turn and face and stop running from it, it's going to overwhelm me. It's going to swallow me up. And how might we respond to that?
Well, if I'm in a therapy session, I respond to it in one way, and if I'm here giving information, I respond to it in a different way. But so, for example, I've had many people over the years say, I'm afraid if I let myself start crying, I'm never going to stop. And I'm just going to turn into a big puddle. And I'll say, well, if that's the case, then don't worry. I will call an ambulance for you, and we will see about, I do some kind of ironic thing. It's my way of saying people, yeah, that's the fear that you have, but it's not real. Emotions come and they go. They're there for a reason, and when they get listened to, they tend to diminish. So I understand that fear is there, particularly if there's a particular emotion that we've been running from for a long time. So take it step by step. You don't have to deal with all of this at once, but take a little time to be quiet with yourself and not run away so intensely from whatever it is that seems to be threatening you. The other thing, of course, is acting out and acting in. So many, I'm, as we expressed on the podcast, and I've seen statistics now supporting that, is that there's an increase in domestic violence around, at least in this country. I don't know about in other countries, but I'm assuming probably similarly. So people do that. They do a lot of acting in, drugging and various other kinds of things, because so many of our coping mechanisms have been taken away by what we have to do to protect ourselves against this virus. And yeah, so I've never experienced it that once an emotion is felt, that it stays forever. I can just say it that clearly. It doesn't, I've never seen it work that way. Now, maybe there's an exception out there, but I've been doing this a long time, and I've never seen that happen. I've only seen people get stuck in places when they're really fighting against the internal state.
Well, what we do see quite often, and I know you've talked a lot about this, and I've seen this too, for example, people that go to a meditation retreat, for example, and they sit and they try to be present with themselves, try to, reflect internally, and then they do have an uptick of anxiety or panic that comes with that. So again, I'm just trying to think about how people would hear what we're saying and have these kind of reactions to it. It's like, well, I've tried to like sit with my feelings or sit with my helplessness in a meditation retreat, and that didn't go well. So,
well, and there are some issues that are hard to separate out, or just work on alone. We can only do so much with these dynamics by ourselves, because we're not able to see what the actual internal conflict is often, because we're so identified with it. So there are a lot of therapists, NARM therapists and other therapists, who are increasingly doing remote therapy sessions. So it's also an opportunity for you to get some personal work. If you're feeling really in distress, really overwhelming anxiety, then the kind of little exercise that I was suggesting to people probably won't work so effectively. It's still good to keep it in mind, not to run. But so then I encourage people to get help, because there is help out there now in many different venues.
Another question I was thinking about is, this is a little challenging territory for us in NARM. For those of people that don't know NARM yet, we can explain this, but I think a lot of people on here have some familiarity with NARM. But a lot of, we're all getting emails probably flooded with like, come to this class teaching you these like self-regulation skills or stress relief skills in a time of coronavirus. And, in NARM, we don't so much focus on the behavioral interventions, the behavioral skills. So how can someone who's coming here today in an hour and a half, or reading the book, or coming to one of our online webinars, what can they take that's not so much like a quick skill, but can start to be kind of like an orientation for them in their life that might be kind of a more long-term support, as opposed to just kind of breathing away something in the here and now?
Well, there are limitations to this, but it goes back to the original title of the book, Connection, Our Deepest Desire and Greatest Fear. And ultimately, though, connection is our deepest resource. So that means some kind of connection to other people, whether it's virtual or, those of you who are with your partners or your families, then, then that kind of emotional and physical connection is also very helpful. And then the other part I'm talking about in terms of not running away is not disconnecting from yourself. That's another way to put it. Is like when we run away, in the variety of ways that we do that, we disconnect from ourselves. And when we do that, we actually increase our stress level. We have less access to the prefrontal cortex. Our social engagement system goes offline. Everything is shutting down. We don't have access to the deepest resources that we have. So I think on all levels, we do the best we can with this, of course, and different people have different capacities, but at least to keep in the idea that maybe I don't have to run away from some of these challenging emotions, and take it step by step.
And I just wanted to add that in NARM, since we hold the theoretical concept that people do connect and disconnect, that is a natural process, that maybe you can help for people out there who are new to the model differentiate between efforting to connect or trying to stay connected as a behavior versus this natural connection disconnection that we all, expansion contraction, connection disconnection, that we all naturally have a rhythm around.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing, we can only use efforting on a behavioral level. So for example, we can use efforting not to withdraw from our partner. We can make a conscious intention that rather than go watch videos and disconnect from them, that we will actually talk about what's going on. That's something that we can do. Now, what we can't use efforting to do is to change our internal state. There we can, but what we do find is that as people connect or stay present, have this particular intention of staying present to their emotions, they change. So it's the difference between efforting through the will and a certain kind of mindful intention of just staying present to ourselves the best we can. And in these times, that's going to vary from person to person. And not to be hard on ourselves for those times we disconnect too, because that just increases disconnection. So in a nutshell, that illuminates some important elements of the NARM approach.
So that there's another piece there about what we might call self-compassion, self-acceptance, about, I mean, this is just kind of a colloquial, kind of a way of saying it, but just, doing the best we can, really, and giving ourselves a little bit of slack.
Yeah. Well, again, one of the deep resources, again, we're covering a little ground that we covered in the podcast, but is that, there's a tremendous amount of suffering in the world right now. Our suffering, and the poorest people are being, in various countries, are being hit the hardest. They have less options to social distance. But as we stay with ourselves and we stay with our heart, and that's, the compassion that is there for ourselves, and the compassion that's there for the world, for all of the people that are struggling right now. And it's really an unusual kind of crisis where almost everyone is, I mean, with our exceptions, but almost everyone is suffering equally. It doesn't matter how much money you have, what political party, what country you're in. There are no guarantees that you're not going to be exposed to this. So on that level, there's a great equalizing, and compassion for the helplessness, the real suffering that's there, the deaths, people are losing people, all of those things that we can't do anything about. That compassion at least helps us to stay open in our hearts and open to the challenges that we have, and the challenges that our clients have, our families, and ultimately the whole world.
So there's a bunch of questions. I'm going to get to the ones that are more relevant to kind of this first part of our focus here today. The question about, can we talk more about the therapist's kind of core attitude or core sense of themselves, and how that can be a catalyst for helping clients stay in touch or getting in touch with their emotions?
Well, one of the things that we do is that, and it's really part of the meta process in NARM, is that because we've done our own work, we also can then communicate a certain confidence to the client that they don't have to keep running away from these difficult emotions, because we're not afraid. And that confidence and that regulation is borrowed by the clients in the relational process of the therapeutic alliance. And that makes a huge difference, just that, you can deal with the real frightening elements, and your therapist isn't freaked out. And that's true in the best of times, and that's true now in these difficult times, is that, therapists don't need to be Buddhas or completely enlightened, but we do need to be a little bit more emotionally developed than the people that we're working with, and that then can be communicated in direct and indirect ways to our clients.
It reminds me of, I got this great advice being a teacher early on, that, as a teacher, you just need to be one step ahead, one chapter ahead of your students. And, that might be the same for us as therapists. But there's another question that's related to this, Larry, about, like, it's a very general question, but it's an important one, is how can we stay connected to ourselves as therapists during this time? Like, is there anything more specifically for us?
Well, hopefully we've got more experience in not running away from ourselves, so we can build on that experience that we have in dealing with, let's say, more developmental kinds of things, and use that, imported to dealing with the very real fears and anxieties that are going on now, and finding that balance between appropriate precautions and the tendency to catastrophize that many people default to when other older fears are surfacing. You know, because there's a, you know,
Did Larry freeze there?
Yeah.
Yep.
a concept
Let's see if Larry's gonna unfreeze.
that many
I think, you know, Zoom's been kind of freezy lately because I think so many people are using it.
you out there have heard that's a NARM concept, and that has to do with futuristic.
Larry?
I don't seem frozen, but
Larry? Okay, Larry's gone now. So hopefully he'll jump back in. So Stephanie, I know that right now you're actually on a break, but so you're kind of in an interesting time that you're not actually currently working with clients, but just any thoughts about, you know, how for you that question about like for us as therapists, like how we can stay connected to ourselves, because you know we have our own life, we have our own families that we're dealing with, our own anxieties, our own fears, and then how to support us to stay present with our clients.
Yeah. And I actually have, even though I am on a break right now, I have been checking in with my clients because just the situation in life has changed so much since I took my break. It felt appropriate to check in with people. And yeah, I mean, aside from the fact that we're all sort of in the same boat, which isn't quite the case when we're working with people usually, we're not all going through the same thing at the same time. We're also like trying to figure out how to work in kind of uncomfortable and different circumstances. Like I'm pretty much sitting in my closet right now, you know, so just some of the things that made us comfortable, some of our routines that helped us feel connected and support our clients have been taken away as well. You know, we're fighting for internet connection with our kids that are on Zoom school, and we're, you know, worried about noise in the background, and it's just a very different time. You know, I like what we were talking about self-compassion, about really being able to meet ourselves in a compassionate way, with the fact that like therapists, like I don't want to compare us to medical professionals at all because they're on the front line in a super scary way, but therapists are, you know, people who are putting themselves out there to hold and be a container, and it's difficult. I would recommend, and what's helping me is a lot of what we're doing right now, talking with other therapists, having our own talking and listening time, where we get supported in how hard it is to be having our own material stirred up while also trying to be containers and be there in a neutral and calm way for our clients. I think it's never been more important than it is right now to get together with peers and other therapists and discuss our experiences. That's been the biggest resource for me.
Yeah, and just another part to add to, it's kind of connecting something that you're saying with what Larry was saying before, is I'm noticing, you know, the connections that I'm having both with my clients and also friends and family. There is a more heartfelt, it reminds me like after 9/11 in the United States, or, you know, after big kind of environmental disasters, you have this window of where people's survival strategies are quieted down a little bit, at least interpersonally. And there's more of this access to compassion and heartfulness because, like Larry said, we're all going through this together. And for me, that's very touching because I think that's what we most desire, is to have that connection to our own hearts and to share that with other people. So, you know, I'm looking, like a lot of us, for the silver linings that come out of this. And I think for me, that's one of them, that the connections I've been having feel so much more vulnerable, but in a really authentic, loving way. Demonstrating our care for each other and looking out for each other. And yeah, so that's, you know, one of the pieces that also is there.
One
So
of the things that
Larry, we missed all of what you said. So
I got frozen out.
yeah.
Yeah.
No?
Can you
I'll
hear
have to
us?
I'll have to do it another way. I have to, wait a second.
Yeah.
Sorry about the, let's see. Okay.
So Larry, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I don't think he can.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Now can you
Larry,
hear? Now?
yes.
There you are.
Can you
You're
hear us?
back.
You know, it reminds me, Brad, of something that I talk about in the training sometimes. What you were just mentioning is that often people, even people who haven't done much personal work, for example, at a funeral, it tends to, because we're there face to face with some of the essential helplessness that's part of life, and some people, of course, shut down, but many people open their heart and get more connected and more caring. And just like you said, in natural disasters and other kinds of situations where human beings, in some ways, it can bring out the most heartful, the best parts of who we are as human beings. And hopefully that's some of what will come out of this, you know, this tragedy that is going on right now.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit on that podcast, but I think I mentioned it. But like, you know, so many traditional cultures have built into the culture grief and ways of processing grief and rituals and even daily meditations and prayer. And it's like our culture, at least in the United States and North America, is very disconnected. I mean, the way that we face loss is quite dysfunctional. And so then, of course, when times like this happen, we use all sorts of strategies and patterns to run because it's not built into our society, to our families. And again, another silver lining that maybe this allows us to really look at the community and relational aspects of how we process grief and loss together. So Larry, you cut out, so we missed all of what you said before, and a couple people wanted to hear it because it was very interesting, it sounded like. So do you remember?
What was I talking about at the time?
Futuristic memory.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, just that
memory.
that we all, and that's where catastrophizing tends to come from, is that we take something that has already occurred to us in one form or another, and then we project it forward as our worst fear in the future, but it's already happened to us. So then, you know, and I know it's surprising to people when I talk about that, but for example, even death, we for, you know, the people, of course, there's this fear of death that generally human beings have, but each individual, if you explore it with them, has a different take on what it means to them and what, you know, what it is that they're projecting forward, because we don't know what death is. We don't, you know, we all have different ideas about it. But the very fact that even something like that is so basic tends to be a projection screen for unresolved issues. It could be abandonment that we've never worked through. It could be a sense of aloneness that we've never worked through. It could be, for some people, I've had that it's some kind of punishment that, you know, dynamics that they haven't worked through. So we want to see, when we get into this catastrophizing mode, you know, of course we want to be realistic about what's happening, but to be aware that generally that information is coming from something already unresolved that we've been carrying, or I mean, something that's unresolved that we've been carrying around for some many years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So, and we've got tons of questions coming in, which is awesome. Let me see which ones. This one I'm really interested to hear from the two of you, and I can share a little bit too. But there's a question about, there's two questions that are kind of related. So a question about that some clients right now are actually thriving with the crisis, feeling more alive, less depression. Any thoughts on this? And then there's another follow-up question, but that's the first part of the question, about thoughts of people that are really kind of finding shifts, positive shifts.
Well, there's some very old studies that showed that during World War II, for example, the suicide rates dropped tremendously. And it's something, I think, at least in part, that for some people to have an external threat helps them manage the internal threat that they've been carrying that didn't, you know, like what we talk about in NARM as nameless dread. Now all of a sudden the dread has a name, and it's the coronavirus, and so it gives us a certain kind of focus, and it is actually relaxing to some people to have named the dread. That only works for a while, but it does. It's not surprising that some people are feeling more kind of energized by this. And like that statistic that was very very clearly showed that when there is an external enemy, whether it's a virus or in a war or whatever, is that it for many people it helps them to organize and be less oriented towards turning all of their anger against themselves.
I also think about it from the perspective of some of the identifications that we carry, some of the ways that we direct shame or self-hatred against ourselves in how we compare ourselves to other people. Identifications around what we think we have to be worthy or valuable, how productive we have to be, or how successful we have to be to matter or to have a place or to belong. Some of these deep identifications that we carry can really get kind of neutralized at a time like this where nobody can really do anything. So I've been exploring that with some of my clients. It's been really interesting to see how that has calmed and comforted some people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Many people have shared with me too, and I have to confess, I've had some of this reaction myself, is that there is also some relief in that we all tend to work so hard and constantly things coming, this pipeline of things that have to be done. And here it's not our fault that we're not doing stuff because we don't have, so we don't have to feel guilty about it. And it's a relief, and it kind of takes us back to a slower time. Modern Western human beings in particular, have such a difficult time slowing down and just spending more time with themselves and with their loved ones and really being in contact. And so for some people who are using it that way, I've also heard and experienced it myself, as I said, some relief in all of that.
Yeah. I think I talked about that on our podcast. I mean, I noticed that from the day that we went into shelter, that my life, it almost reminded me like, you're going through really bad turbulence on a plane, and it's like there's a way that you can either like fight against it and feel anxious, or you just, I have absolutely no control here. I'm just going to relax and surrender. Like whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And for me, there was a kind of a similar feeling with that. It's like, I can't control that my life is completely changing at the drop of a hat here. And I'm just going to kind of relax into it. And I know for me that's been nice. And I imagine, being a client on the end of a therapist like this, it feels much more spacious, because I'm able to meet them with less of that kind of sympathetic energy that's running through me on a day-to-day basis. So
yeah, good point.
So another question that came up with really interesting, and this is going to maybe take us a little bit more into talking about general NARM principles, although it probably relates to that previous question, is this person said they went through our training and there was a lot of focus on emotional completion in terms of grief and anger, which is true. The missing emotions. But they wanted to know more about quote unquote positive emotions. So the role that positive emotions like joy, gratitude, and the question is, I'm wondering to what extent you look for or explore these positive emotions if they arise in the clinical process.
Well, if this person will remember, the fourth pillar is which is part of those of you who are not familiar with the model, it's part of the NARM protocol, maybe too strong a word, but there are four basic pillars that we develop our clinical model from. And the fourth one of those pillars is that we reflect any kind of shift towards increasing connection, and that increasing connection, increasing expansion, and then anchor that in bodily experience. And so that means then that real positive emotions, joy, love, gratitude, compassion, all of these emotions. Some clearly qualify as emotions, others in slightly different category, but they're all, what they share in common is that there's an expansive quality to them. And we're supporting the possibility of increasing expansion, and in NARM at the same time recognizing that we're all carrying around inbuilt, well, not inbuilt, but learned, let's put it that way, learned uh, adaptive survival mechanisms that once saved our lives but now limited us. And so the biggest fear, and this is really part of the paradigm shift in NARM, is that we're supporting the movement from a contracted and collapsed states, tense and collapsed states, into increasing expansion. And for that model, I've drawn on Reich's original model of affects, which was very simple, energetically based. And he had three affects. One was what we might call pleasure, but it's sometimes misunderstood. That includes joy, it includes, it includes all kinds of expansiveness. What?
Compassion, gratitude.
Compassion, all of those but they're experienced as pleasurable, but not to be confused with just the pursuit of pleasure. That's what the distinction I was trying to make. So that is movement of energy from the core to the periphery. His second emotion, affect.
So before we move on, I think just for folks that don't know what the core or periphery means, can you just...
Oh, okay, good point. That's true. There are people who haven't done that. Yeah. So I'm talking on a bodily level. I think that's a good point, and I think I can actually answer it better by going to the next one, which is anxiety, because everybody has recognized anxiety is the movement of energy from the core, which is the the external parts of our body, expands
periphery.
From the periphery to the core. Everybody has experienced the tightness in the chest, the tightness in the gut. That's that energy that is being moved from the periphery and held in the core. Whereas joy, pleasure, real pleasure, compassion, love, excitement, creativity, all of these are pleasurable dynamics which indicate movement of energy from the core to the periphery. The third affect in his model was anger, which is energy that moves from the core to the musculature. And that makes sense because that's movement to help us then gear up to meet whatever challenge or threat is there. And so it's a simple but useful way of looking at the three basic affects. And now if we're talking about emotions, of course, there are many different emotions, but as the person rightly recognized, we have focused on, on anger, integrating anger, and on completing grief on an emotional and somatic level. And as we do that, the capacity for expansion increases. So the person's capacity to love, the person's capacity to be present, the person's self-regulation improves greatly. There's no question that there are new neural pathways that are created when people are having more access to these pleasurable states. And so I want to thank the person, whoever it was, for asking that question. It doesn't always come up in these webinars, and it's a useful time to at least begin to put that model out there, because it's very important to the NARM model. So one last comment about that, since that's the fourth pillar, that's where everything gets integrated. And that's what makes NARM a body-oriented psychotherapy, even though it's quite different from some of the traditional body-oriented psychotherapies. But that anchoring, that final stage of anchoring these positive shifts, these shifts towards increasing connection in physical experience, is so transforming, because all of us know and have had the experience that we can know something in our head, but when we don't really know it in our bodies, in our guts, in our core, and that kind of knowing is so much more impactful. Last point to go to that question is that in NARM, it's central. We talk about the embodied adult consciousness, and that's a key phrase in our work, that as we embody more, as we come out of tension and collapse, we experience more expansion and all kinds of capacity for pleasurable emotions. And um, that is like an antidote to the shutdown, tension, collapse, and freeze.
I wanted just to kind of make note that when Larry's referring to the fourth pillar, he's referring to we have a model called the 4 pillars, which are the basic clinical skills of NARM. And the fourth pillar, I like to joke for those of people that are familiar with yoga, that the fourth pillar is the Shavasana phase of NARM, which is the integration phase. And I think it is something really unique to somatic therapies generally and NARM specifically, that clients so quickly want to just like jump to the next story, to the next symptom. And in NARM, we really want to, support the nervous system, our physiology to reorganize. And if we go too quickly, then we're missing opportunities for the reorganization, for the integration. So that's what, when Larry's referring to the somatic focus of that fourth pillar, that's really what we're focusing on, that when there's these shifts happening, we really want to do the best we can to support our client's system to really allow time to shift in a more organized direction.
And as consistent with our model, we also anticipate that there will be a limit to that. That's and right. When the person gets to the limit of their capacity for pleasure or joy, we want to explore, what is it that's coming up that's getting in the way of you staying with that? And so that's another piece, and it really is central to the NARM work.
Yeah. So quick answer to Jeff's question. So Jeff asked, where can I learn more about the 3 affect states? So Jeff, if you look in your manual, Jeff was one of our students. If you look in your manual for the 3rd and 4th modules, we do go more into that. There's actually a nice image of like Wright's 3 different affect states and how we have integrated it into NARM. But if you really want to read the source of it, then of course Wright has many books that were well ahead of their time, even though they're now 100 years almost, but he was the founder of this whole field of somatic psychology. So, so Larry, another interesting question. I have some clients whose OCD is coming up to the forefront again. Can you talk about NARM? She's asking for NARM comparison to a specific approach, ERP, which I'm not familiar with, but can you just talk about how NARM might differentiate from other models in working with OCD?
Well, it's an interesting time too, because a lot of people with OCD are saying, I was right. See, we should be washing our hands all the time. So it gets tricky that way. But in terms of the bigger question, how do we work with OCD? Is that, as opposed to particularly like exposure therapies, which tend to be unfortunately, from my perspective, the more common approach to this, is that we're not looking to extinguish symptoms of OCD. Those are just, in our mind, just that. They're just symptoms. We always want to know what it is that's driving these symptoms, because the rituals and the obsessive thinking, all of that are symptoms of, one, high levels of arousal, and always at the same time very distorted sense of self, distorted sense of identity, and the interplay between those 2 dynamics. And you can't just deal with just the arousal piece, because so much of the arousal is also being driven by self-hatred and self-rejection. It goes deeper into the model, but I've experienced, I've consulted for clinics that specialize in, at that time, MPD, multiple personality. Oh, no, that's, I'm getting that mixed up with DID, but with OCD. And this model of working with what is driving these symptoms is so very different than just trying to extinguish all of the difficult, and the symptoms, of course, are painful, but we think there's a better way to deal with them.
Stephanie, anything you wanted to add with the OCD piece here? Something you've worked with?
Just a question that comes up a lot of times with people who are struggling with really extreme symptoms is a lot of people will ask me, what about using both at the same time? A lot of clients who are in real distress around debilitating OCD symptoms will ask about, well, what about exploring what's causing them, and then also going to somebody to try to extinguish them. So just any comments that you might have about that. That comes up quite a bit in my practice.
I guess I would have to know what exactly the other um, is.
Like a cognitive behavioral approach, like going to somebody for that kind of cognitive behavioral approach where you're trying to, you know, bring the numbers down of the arousal in a, you know, by exposure.
They don't fit.
They don't fit.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
No, I put NARM on the opposite.
Larry, say a little bit more, because I think this, you know, a lot of us have been trained in CBT, or so how would you say they don't fit, and are there ways that they do fit?
Well, CBT doesn't deal with, it doesn't even talk about arousal in the body. They don't even focus on the body. They're focusing on the symptoms, but if you don't focus on the arousal that's driving the symptoms, you're missing the point. And our orientation in NARM is to listen to the symptoms and what is the deeper message. Sometimes it takes a while to get to what is the deeper message by that symptom. But again, it's always a way, in my experience, these kinds of obsessive and compulsive symptoms are ways of trying to manage internal states that people don't know how to manage in any other way. And so that's where they develop the rituals and the obsessive thinking to try and manage that. And it just doesn't fit with CBT, period.
Larry, your mic must have gone off somehow, because now I think it's coming through the computer.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't understand why.
Okay. I think this happened to us the other day, and so you clicked something on your computer to get you back, I think, but.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think you're back now. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
So basically, you're saying you're working at cross purposes. If somebody is coming to a NARM therapist for exploration to try to listen to the symptom, and then going to an OCD, a cognitive behavioral therapist to try to reduce the symptom, that you're working at cross purposes.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, something's going on with your mic, but we'll just do that.
Yeah, you know, I can see it on my screen. There must be a short here because it's bouncing in and out from the computer to this professional microphone that I have.
You know what? Maybe unplug the mic and just talk into your computer, because it seems like it's, yeah.
Okay, so I've done that.
Okay. So there's an interesting question, or it's kind of a reflection that came up. I'd like to hear your perspective on it. That the person was saying that this experience that we're going through somehow looks like a bereavement process. We were talking about grief before, and that therapists and clients there's like a mirroring that's happening. So as we as therapists in our own process can assist clients in their own process at the same stage or at another. So basically, I think what they're saying is that there's some kind of mirroring, that as we are able to be present with our own grief, that's supporting our clients.
Yeah, that's extremely important, because if we're there in a mechanical way, on some level the client senses it. So it goes back to what you and I were talking about earlier. It's like it has to do with the therapist's own personal work and ability to be in this, you know, not to run away from the grief or the bereavement that's going on. That communicates a certain confidence to the client that they also don't have to run away.
Yeah, and I always think of it, it's like mimicking secure attachment in this. I know we're not trying to be an attachment figure for our clients, but there is a way that was what was missing. That as a child, when we were going through different states of distress, we needed this security from our environment, from our caregivers. And so we can support our clients to find that place within themselves, and we can kind of model that and create an environment for that.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that, you know, it does provide a corrective experience. Therapy in itself, by just having, you know, particularly the way I think that we hold the therapeutic alliance and the therapeutic meeting in NARM, does ultimately function as a corrective experience for people. To have somebody who you can talk to, who doesn't judge you, who's really curious about your inner world, isn't just trying to fix you, you know, like you were some broken machine. Like the ways that we hold NARM feel, you know, and that was so much a part of my orientation, is that to really make this a human experience, you know, again, rather than away from these manualized, protocolized interventions that, from my perspective, treat people like, well, just batches of symptoms, and really in a very mechanistic way. And so I see I see NARM as an antidote to those kinds of therapeutic models.
Yeah. There's a couple questions. One from Rosina, who's our first and only NARM therapist in Bangladesh. So welcome, Rosina. It's good to connect with you again. So she asked a good question. A couple of people have asked the same kind of question. Is there any special consideration for, so many of us are now, pretty much all of us are going telehealth. So we're working online with our clients. Is there any special considerations that you can think of, or Stephanie, that you have in mind about how to integrate NARM in this way?
Yeah, there was the same question that popped up from one of my students in the Netherlands. I saw that come up earlier, so it's good that we bring that up. But Stephanie, go ahead, since I know you're doing a lot of that these days. Maybe you could address that.
I can only say that I've been incredibly surprised at how much of a relational field can be really held through tiny pictures on screens. I was definitely, I've been doing a lot of work through Zoom and Skype for years now, because I've been providing consultations and experiential consults with clients, with students of NARM. And I was very resistant at first and didn't feel that it would have the same oomph. And of course it feels different, but there is a really powerful relational field that you can feel through these screens. I don't do anything different really, other than, from the waist down, I might be in my pajamas. So kind of awesome. But I don't really feel that I apply the model any differently at all, actually. That's my experience. What about you, Brad, Larry?
Well, I've also, over the years, because I've also been doing this, not to the same frequency that you have, but I've been doing sessions and of course consultations over the years via Zoom and Skype and so on. And the interesting thing that I found that I wouldn't have guessed is that my resonance with a person stays very much the same. That's the relational field, I think, that you were talking about. So that those of you who worked with me know that, I very much am in resonance with the people that I work with. I'm tracking my own inner states as one of the sources of information of what's going on for the client. And that doesn't seem to change at all, because I can feel in my heart, like if there's something starting to open up in a person's heart and they're starting to feel some pain in their heart, I feel some pain in my heart. It doesn't change, despite the fact that we're being linked electronically rather than in the same room. So it says something interesting about the human experience. On one level, we know that what a good actor can do is create, whatever method they're using to draw on this, but through this visual and auditory medium, they can evoke all kinds of emotions in us. And it's also on a visual, like it's not live. So it just says something about who we are as human beings and how significant and central emotional process is to us as human beings.
So there's a question about, there's about 3 questions in this question, but the first one's about Viktor Frankl and his concept of self-transcendence as a way of moving past self-absorption in a time of crisis. And any thoughts about kind of how his work and his kind of perspective might fit or align with NARM?
Well, I have read his book, but it's been so many years ago that it's hard for me to really respond to the question, because I don't have a clear enough understanding. But I think that the gist of the question was something that you responded to earlier, is that sometimes these, when we find ourselves in death, or death situations, or birth situations, or trauma, like environmental trauma, like you've been in the fires for several years in a row in Northern California, for example, and how those tend to bring out in many people, not in everybody, but in many people, a real a movement out of their normal personality dynamics into a more heartful and connected and compassionate place with other people. Then there are the guys that dress up in hazmat suits and knock on people's door and do a break and enter. So they're obviously not participating in that human experience. You know, that was just a video that somebody sent me, and this was one of the scams. That scam means this was like for those of you who are not native speakers of English, it's like an illegal thing that people were using, dressing up in these hazmat suits, which are these big protective suits that look like spacemen, and they came and knocked on people's doors. People would open their doors, they bust in and rob the house. So here's take the other end of the spectrum, taking advantage of these situations. But we're going to focus on the fact that, you know, as I think Frankl also, that's what he was getting at, is that we can move beyond the limitations of our more restrictive personality.
Yeah. So another question that came up as part of this, and you know, we don't need to get into kind of, comparing NARM so specifically to other approaches, but this person said that they felt like you were misrepresenting that there are somatic dimensions in CBT training, particularly through the Beck Institute. And so maybe you could just be more specific about what is the somatic elements of NARM that you feel like really contribute to some of the shifts that maybe aren't found as much in more cognitive behavioral approaches.
Well, it's been interesting to me to watch some of CBT kind of.
Larry, your hands are a little bit blocked.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. It's been interesting for me to watch how CBT has kind of rediscovered the wheel in certain ways, like bringing the body into, bringing certain kind of relationality into what wasn't a relational process earlier. So, you know, I'm not here, you know, I'm not a practitioner of CBT, so I'm not wanting to make it just about CBT, but in NARM, one of the elements is that all of our identifications are held in the body in the form of tension and or collapse. Now that understanding is not part of CBT. They might talk about stress in the body in certain ways, but I've never seen anything that's even close to that, addressing that dynamic. It's different even than psychodynamic work too, because you know, in psychodynamic work, they will talk about identifications in some, at least in some particular models. But the very fact that, and I want to go back to this because it's so central to NARM, is that identifications, in other words, all of the ideas, and particularly the distorted ideas that we have about ourselves, are not just mental processes, but there is always a psychobiological component to that. And these seemingly mental processes are held in the body in the form of tension and collapse. And again, I don't think that that's part of CBT. I don't think it's part of traditional psychodynamic work. And I think that's where there's an important addition that we can make.
And this relates to, there was another question about, you know, we kind of have this shorthand. We talk about the embodied adult consciousness. We talk about child consciousness. And someone wanted just to know a little bit more about what we mean by that.
Well, embodied adult consciousness is basically what we're supporting the possibility of people moving increasingly toward. What that means then on a practical level and how it relates to what I was just talking about is that as we work through these often trauma-generated adaptations and distortions about who we are, the self-rejection, the self-judgment, the self-hatred, the self-condemnation, all of those kinds of things, as we work through those elements, that the person comes progressively more and more into their body. They become more, because all these old ideas, and I use that word, you know, cautiously because people think of it as a mental process, but as we explore these old identifications, then these bodily shifts naturally happen, and people report them as feeling more spaciousness, more room internally. They'll feel more grounded, they feel more settled. There are a variety of ways that their vision changes. All, you know, that many people, when they've had a good NARM session or sometimes other therapies, they'll see, wow, my vision is clearer, and my range of vision is broader. That's consistent with what Reich discovered over 100 years ago. And this is then moving towards an embodied adult consciousness, as opposed to, let's say, the thinking subtype of the connection survival style. they can, these are thinkers, they're very early traumatized people, and they've managed the trauma by going into their head and believing that they can think everything through. They tend to be data-driven people, and the idea, if I just get the facts and I can figure everything out, I'm going to be okay. They can have objective consciousness in a certain way. They can be great physicists or IT people or whatever, but they're not embodied. And so when it comes to personal knowing themselves or an increased capacity for connection with another human being, it doesn't help that. As a matter of fact, it's a distancing dynamic that people use to stay in their heads. So that's why we talk about it, the embodied adult consciousness, which is an increasing objective consciousness, where we're not seeing the world through old lenses, the lenses of old identifications and old object relations, but seeing the world in a fresher way from the embodied and in the here and now.
So I know we don't want to reduce things too much, but for the sake of people that don't understand some of the kind of NARM principles yet, could you say that being in our embodied adult consciousness is when some of our prefrontal areas are more online versus when we're in our child states or child consciousness? You know, Daniel Siegel talks about flipping the lid, and that our prefrontal areas are not fully functioning, not online.
It's, you know, it's fully consistent with Porges's theory, because when we're in a child consciousness, we're in some kind of threat mode. You know, when we're responding to the world, we're adults now, but we're responding to the world as if we were children, because we're stuck in some old identification, something our partner says or something that's going on in the world. There's this threat mode, there's this uptick of sympathetic activation. As soon as you get this uptick, then slowly the social engagement system is going offline, and as this goes offline, so does the prefrontal cortex. And so, just exactly as you said, Brad, the more embodied and present and that we are, the more access to the prefrontal cortex and clear thinking that we have. It's one of the differences between NARM and CBT, is that we think that often everybody's in favor of clear thinking, but how do you most effectively get there? And we find that actually by emotional completion and working through these old identifications that we've all developed, that supports more objective, you know, and clear capacity on a cognitive level.
Yeah. So a really interesting question here that came in earlier, which I think, again, it's fitting with where we're talking about here, is in NARM we talk about a core dilemma. And the question is basically, once I've identified my core dilemma in myself, why can't I just let go of the adaptive strategies that are dysfunctional and move into a healthier aspect that's aligned with my true self?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm sure it's in a lot of people's minds, because there is no such thing as letting go.
Say more.
Nobody lets go of anything, because you see, letting go involves personal will. And personal will can be used on a behavioral level, as I said earlier, but we can't, through the personal will ourselves to relax. You know, sometimes we do relax, but not because of the will, but just bringing our attention to the tent, you know, to the way that we've been holding on, like you described in the airplane. Sometimes then a letting go can happen, but we can't make it happen any more than, you know, I like to use these examples like from the sexual arena, any more than we can make ourselves aroused. You know, we can become aroused, but we can't force ourselves to be aroused. Or that we can make ourselves love somebody, you know, or that we can make ourselves forgive somebody. See, all of these ideas that these are subject to the personal will are something that I don't accept, and I just don't think that it works. So it would be great to go back to the question from the person who wrote in, if we could do that. But that's when that kind of knowing of the core conflict is more cognitive, would be my guess, is that that's what the person is really talking about. And it has to be embodied. We have to experience it, because we can't think our way out of threat, for example. And most of these most of the core conflict represents some kind of very profound threat that we haven't worked through yet. When the working through happens, every single person that I've ever worked with who's had that kind of working through experience, then the identification with the core conflict lessens significantly over time.
Yeah. You're probably disappointing a lot of people here that have strong will structures that don't like hearing this. Not that I can relate to that at all, but yeah. No, but I, you know, having been around your teaching for all these years now, I being on the other side to some extent of my strong will, I can really understand what you're saying from a more internal place, because, you know, we think that it's our effort that gets us here, when in fact it's actually quite the opposite. It's the effort that often disrupts really just trusting in what we can bring into the world. And I know that from my own personal experience, and I'm seeing that so much more clearly as I work through my own pressure that I put on myself.
Well, you know, it ultimately, interestingly, the antidote to will is confidence. See, when we have a certain kind of confidence and implicit faith in ourselves and ultimately in the universe and the world, then we don't have to try and control everything so much like we do with the will. So confidence isn't something that we can create with the will either. It doesn't respond to affirmations or, you know, that kind of thing. Confidence comes as we experience ourselves being able to work through the different things that we have been struggling with over time. We gain increasing confidence.
Yeah. Stephanie, did you want to add something here?
Just the related to this question, what one of the things that Larry said, and Larry, you've said in trainings before, is the idea that it lets go of you, that you don't let go, you can't let go of it. That's through efforting and will, but that as this working through happens, as we get in touch with more and more in touch with the core emotions, with the primary emotions, the incomplete anger and grief, so that's the working through, that it actually lets go of us. The identifications soften and let go of us. And that's always been a comforting and helpful way of looking at it, because so much in my therapy sessions, people will come to a sense of understanding about something and then ask the question, so what do I do? So what do I do? That I think we all experience that from our clients.
Yeah.
And that desire to be able to do something with the knowledge, and that's just not how it happens.
Right. There's the flip side of that, Stephanie, I'm glad you brought that up too, is that when we're in a really expanded, you know, pleasant, joyful, alive state, that we often, then the client will be feeling, you know, so good session. They're feeling very, you know, in their heart, very in their bodies, expanded, so on and so forth. I say, oh, I just want to hold on to this. Right. And that's also when I say,
how do I hold on to this?
Yeah, how do I hold on to this? And then I say, well, you notice it only took us maybe, you know, 35 minutes just with a little bit of help from me, and this state was available to you. So notice, and that's after all of these years, because often it's a state that they haven't experienced since they were a child, for example. And I say, so notice that even after all of this time, this state is still available to you because it holds on to you. You don't have to hold on to it. So it's, beautiful. You know, and it takes me back to the earlier questions about, you know, positive affects. The whole model of NARM, if you look at the distortions of the life force, we're moving from increase, you know, if we go from the top of that distortion of the life force charts, from frozen and shut down and dissociated, to working through integrating anger and the splitting and so on. But ultimately, it's all part of reconnecting to the core energy or the life force, which by definition is alive, heartful, expanded, embodied, pleasurable, even if there's grieving as part of that. You can be grieving and still feel very alive. As a matter of fact, we make a distinction between frozen grief and very alive grief, because alive grief is leading us to someplace and leading us to our hearts. So it's a really important piece to remember, that this support ultimately of our birthright of aliveness is always in the background there in the NARM work.
So a question, Larry, this is going to be a big question to answer, but maybe you can do it in a short way right here, is one of the things that differentiates NARM from other models is we talk a lot about the child's need to protect the attachment relationship and the implications of that long term for us when there's been developmental trauma. So this person wanted just a little bit more understanding of what that means. Like if you could break that down into more kind of basic understanding, what does that actually mean when we say that the child needs to protect the attachment relationship?
When the child isn't feeling loved, supported, having their basic biological needs met, psychobiological needs met in some adequate way, as we talk about in the training, the child cannot experience him or herself or themselves as a good person in a bad situation. They always blame themselves. And that's a way, you see, of protecting the parents and the attachment relationship. It's not that my parents don't have the capacity to love me, which would be catastrophic for a child from a child's perspective. There must be something wrong with me. I'm not lovable. And so they move to that position. And that turning against the self is a way of protecting protecting the parents against the child's anger, which feels threatening to the attachment relationship, and protecting the whole attachment relationship in general. And it's why you see we've always got to be holding in, and we do hold as NARM therapists, like what is it that's getting in the way of this? Is this, the first pillar actually in NARM is like we explore what's getting in the way of having being kinder to ourselves. Well, you see, not being kind to ourselves makes a certain kind of sense if we realize that that's part of the core dilemma. That's a part of the way a child has managed a situation where there was some kind of significant environmental failure that they experienced.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to ask that we're going to kind of go through a few questions. They're all big questions, so maybe just short answers because we don't have a ton of time. And there's a lot of questions about like other things that people can use NARM related that can support them during this time and then larger in terms of their clinical training. So I want to make sure we talk about some of those things that we're offering both online and in person. But here's just a broad question. Is NARM also suitable for couples therapy?
Absolutely. Obviously, there are other skills that are involved in working with couples that if you're not experienced in working with couples, you can't just take the NARM training in the first 2 years anyway, and then just apply that. But if you have already a knowledge base and a clinical experience in working with couples, you can certainly use the NARM concepts as a way of helping this couple come together. Because, for example, an example that, I like this example of agency, is that agency is the third pillar in NARM. But when when couples come in, they tend to be blaming each other for what's gone wrong in the relationship. And we know that as long as they're locked into blaming each other, they're not experiencing any agency. They're making the problem their partner's fault. And we as human beings are good at seeing our partner's problems, but not necessarily as good at seeing our own. So that this whole concept of agency and helping people see their part, that they're bringing elements into that relationship, into that, a couple, into the couple that are their responsibility, unresolved issues in themselves, and even some of the things that they sought in their partner at one point are the things that they end up being so uncomfortable with and so dismissive of and so angry about as the relationship goes on. So there's a definite application, and you're right, it's a big question and very little time to answer it adequately, but there is certainly a place for it. And we're going to be talking more about it because it's one of the questions that's come up regularly now for people.
Yeah, we're talking about even building kind of like a separate or additional track for once you get the basic NARM training, having other, people that work with children, work with families, work with addiction, work with couples, that people can specialize then from a NARM approach and how to work. So there's two questions, and again, another big topic that we talk a lot in the inner circle about, but if you could just, and this is a nice way to kind of maybe start to wrap some of this up at this time, but is the difference between frozen grief and alive grief, or the difference between despair and grief?
Well, it's easier to talk about frozen versus alive, is that we know some people who've experienced a loss, and rather than grieving, they've just shut down into a kind of frozen depression, and there's no movement there. They're very collapsed. And that there's a kind of imploding into oneself that happens in that frozen dynamic, as opposed to in a manageable way dealing with the grief, feeling the emotions, feeling the loss, feeling the anger that also comes with loss, working through the emotions. That's, even though it's sometimes very painful to feel that kind of grief, it's very alive, and it's even experienced as pleasurable because there's a movement of energy from the core to the periphery in that context, going back to the model that we talked about earlier. So it's quite a different dynamic, and I'm sure everybody out there has experienced the difference with themselves, with family members, with their clients, between people who just collapsed and shut down versus people who are in a realistic way dealing with a very, significant losses loss that they've dealt with or that they're dealing with.
There's a question, I guess this is maybe a little bit more for me to answer, that although you can answer for international trainings, but with the current physical distancing requirements, what are our revised plans for our trainings now in the future? And we've been having a lot of meetings over the last couple of weeks about this. And at this point, we're kind of postponing our trainings and anticipating that in a couple months, we will be able to return to normal. But if that's not the case, we're working on contingency plans. We're going to pilot kind of our first hybrid online live training for one of our trainings that's currently in the middle of a training, and see how that works to do some of it online and then kind of complete it in person together. We've been talking a lot about doing more training online. We have our online Inner Circle program that I put the link in the chat box there too. And that's a way of staying connected, whether you've been through our training or whether you're just interested in kind of deepening into NARM. That's a good place to stay connected. Larry, how about internationally? Any news on?
It's pretty much the same thing, and I've been talking with a number of my organizers in Europe, and we're talking too about it now, an increasing online presence and doing things more remotely. Obviously, all of us are hoping for a relatively speedy recovery from this, but none of us really knows at this point. So and it's a use. Hopefully, things will come back to normal, but we'll still have additional offerings online, various different. And Brad and I, in particular, have been focusing on expanding that, just like some of the special programs that Brad just mentioned. And Stephanie too, you've been involved in helping us, identify some specific areas where we can expand the online training to. So that's basically the long-term plan internationally as well.
Yeah, and actually tomorrow we do, Larry won't be involved in this one, but I will, and we're doing a workshop on NARM, specifically working with cultural trauma. And I put the link in there if you want to get more information or sign up for that one.
And that's open to everybody, not just Inner Circle people, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's open to anybody. So, we're trying to make these webinars. We have some that Larry and I have done, or Larry's done on our website too. A lot of people are really interested in the NARM approach to working with agency, which is the third pillar that Larry talked about. And we have a whole 2.5 hour webinar that you can get right on our website. And there's slides and recording and demonstration of Larry applying it clinically. So Let's see. There was a good question, and this is another thing we've been talking a lot about for non-therapists. Are we thinking about developing NARM trainings or workshops for non-therapists? And that is something that we are kind of in the process of doing. We don't have a time frame yet on that because we've been so focused on getting clinicians trained. But we do have plans for that. And if you're interested, then be in touch with us. Let us know. You can write to us at the Institute. And the more, we have contacts of people that are interested, the more we can start to work with you to develop this.
One other thing too that a lot of people don't know, just because we haven't made an official announcement yet, but I co-wrote a book on shame and guilt, and that's at the publisher. It's actually coming out in German first. It's Kuzzle Random House in Germany, but it's going to eventually, in the next year, it'll be out in other languages as well. And that book is written more for the general public. And Brad and I have talked about having a specific, a specific aspect of what we do online to be able to deal with this very significant theme for people, not just for therapists, but more open for the general public. And we're not excluding therapists from it, but we want to make it more accessible for non-therapists as well. So that's also an important development that's happening, and that book should be out in English within about a year as well, and then in other languages. I do want to say too, I always get surprised that many people live in countries that don't know that the book is translated into their language. So just so you know out there, the book is now in 15 different languages, or 13 that are presently published and 2 that are on the way. So there's a good chance that it's depending what your first language is, that it is in your language. And I won't go through all of them, but it's both it includes Japanese and Chinese, and it's coming out in Turkish and all of the European languages, including many of the Eastern Europeans, not in Romanian yet, unfortunately, to our Romanian colleagues out there, but it's in Polish and Czech and Greek and so on. So look for it in and if you can't find it in your native country, send me an email, and I'll check into, if it is actually there and you just don't know about it, because sometimes at first it's hard to find, but we'll help you get access to it in your native language.
So you didn't say which book you're talking about. You're talking about healing development.
This one, there I'm talking about healing developmental traumas in 15 languages. Yeah.
So there's a good question at the end, and I think we're going to have to save this question for our next one, which is what happens to one's identity when we're in social isolation for months. And what I would like to offer is that maybe, we don't know how long this is all going to be lasting, but maybe the 3 of us can come back in a month or so and do this again. And
what I was thinking, Brad, and we'll just put this out, and the viewers can decide, but to actually do, I mean, you mentioned this, but to do an experiential and less talking, more guided exercises, and breakout rooms. You said you had experience recently with using Zoom and breakout spaces. So I haven't done that yet, but that we could do a more experiential, so self-exploration kind of workshop than we've offered so far.
We've already gotten 2. I love that idea. So let's set it up. Let's do it. So look out for that. You'll be getting an email from us about that, because we'll set it up. We're good at kind of turning around and making things happen here. So anything, Stephanie, that you wanted to add as we start wrapping up here?
I just want to say that I've been sitting here reflecting on how adaptive we are as human beings, and just that one of the tenets we hold in NARM is that these adaptations that we made as children were life-saving, and we have so much respect for them. And I just see us all in this time making all these adaptations to how to be together, to how to take our program online. I feel really inspired by the fact that in real time we're seeing how creative and adaptive we are as human beings, and having a lot of respect for it in the same way that we do in the NARM model for the adaptations that we made when we were young.
Yeah. Nice way to bring it to a close, Stephanie. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, you know, for us, it's so important that we, even not in this time, but especially in this time, that we have each other's backs. We're in community together. There's days that we, you know, feel really strong within ourselves. We can be there for support for other people. There's other days we need that ourselves. And so, you know, we're trying to do the best we can to make a community here that can provide some support and be a resource for all of us that are going through this time together. And I know for me personally, I love to learn. And so this has been a really great distraction to have more online webinars. And so we're trying to kind of create that because, you know, I've been dusting off books I've been wanting to read for 10 years. And so this is a time that we can actually dive deeper into some of the stuff that we're so busy and don't have as much time to. So we're going to continue to brainstorm about, I love this idea, Larry, that you came up with. And so look out for more connection from us. And Larry, anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up here?
No, I was actually touched by both your comments and experiencing some of the same too, and just maybe to share with people. I realized the other day I had more time than I've had in months, and I was just sitting on the my computer and jumping from one interesting article to another. I'm just kind of following my interest, and they were all in our field in one form or another. And I thought, wow, you know, after all these years of being a clinician, I'm still interested in this stuff. When I find somebody who's got a different viewpoint or you know, some new way of looking at things, like I'm instantly fascinated. And I thought I felt so fortunate that I'm still, after, you know, 40 some years in this field, I'm still as excited and enthusiastic about understanding myself, understanding others, helping people work with more effectively with others. And so I just know I'm in the right place. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks everyone for connecting and being connected, and we look forward to being with you next time, and we'll be in touch. So thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Larry.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Brad, for moderating.
Thank you.